Two apologies before we get started. One is that I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations about Agnon, about religious fiction. And if I'm going to do that, I'm taking the risk of being corrected. And if I really want to open myself to correction, the best place to do it is in a room full of people who may be capable of correcting me. Second, I'm very much interested in literature for its own sake. In the case of Agnon, the beauty of the language has tremendous attraction. At the same time, my primary obsession is speaking as a religious person, and I'm thinking very much not only about what Agnon is as a general writer, but what Agnon can offer to people whose priority is, Shamayim, is a relationship with God. I'll be making references to non-Jewish Christian writers whom I am almost certain that Agnon never read, and they almost certainly didn't read him, because I want to see how this group, what I might call the Christian Renaissance of the first half of the 20th century, how their way of dealing with religious issues is different from Agnon's, and what could get from either kind of orientation. Agnon's long career coincided with a golden age of powerful Catholic fiction and other literature, both in English and French. I just mentioned names: Mauriac, Georges Bernanos, Graham Greene, most of my references will be to him, Flannery O'Connor. Biographically, for me, I have a foot in both worlds, and I will allude to that a little bit later. How did I come to Agnon? So I may be cynical about it, but I came to him as a high school student reading for Bagrut. And I have to tell you that my contemporaries, even though they were reading it for the exam, many of them were really moved by Agnon. They were reached by him. And what I think in retrospect, the Agnon who made me a fan was a realistic novelist. One of the things we read was Sipur Pashut, was obviously the longest thing that we read. And that is very much a realistic social novel. It's a social novel about a young adult, or if you want to be more precise, about an overripe adolescent who comes to his crisis after he already has a wife and child. And it seemed to me that this Agnon, more than any of his predecessors or peers in Hebrew literature, wielded the ironic and realistic pen of the great European novelists. He described his Jews and their society as they were, in epic scope, accurate in his depiction, painfully precise in rendering the individual heart. And again, once upon a time I was a teenager. Equally free of the rebels' rancor and nostalgic exiles' romanticizing. The sheer beauty of the narration and the seeming honesty naming things as they were, gave him authority and credibility in my eyes. And that carried over when I read other things by him, be it these pious tales that were also assigned in school, or the dreamlike productions of Sefer HaMaasim, and some of these enigmatic, romantic tales where it's very hard to figure out what's happening, and these things that I don't believe were assigned in the high schools. But those also had a certain credibility because it came from somebody who could write this kind of social novel as well. If I come to the question of religious commitment, though, I was very much aware that Agnon was, so to speak, mishalanu, that he was a faithful Jew. I didn't know the vicissitudes in the 30s and early 40s, but it's clear that he described himself Mishlomei Amunei Israel. Nevertheless, when I had to work out my religious position, which involved very much trying to understand the human condition, where does man stand vis-a-vis God? Where does man stand vis-a-vis himself? Agnon, for all that I enjoyed him, was not the Virgil who guided me through that underworld. And I really got more at that stage out of the Catholic novelists, the poets. I'm not going to drag the poets in here. That's background to what I will say further on. I want to look at a few differences between the way Agnon presents the world and the kind of world that I got out of the Greens and the Moriarty's and the O'Connors, and again, look at the poets, T.S. Eliot, prose writers, also fiction writers, C.S. Lewis. One, Agnon's people vary in their personal piety and their knowledge. Having said that, almost all of his significant characters, among whom not the least important is the narrator, who should be distinguished from the author, almost all of them are rooted in Jewish life and lore. If they've drifted away from the tradition, they're still familiar with it. The prospect of adopting traditional Judaism does not appear to these alienated characters as a revolution in one's existence, but as a reversion to a past identity. Among the Christian writers I'm referring to, this is not the case. It's not simply that Graham Greene was a convert, or that Flannery O'Connor was a very, very frum Catholic woman living in the South, where if she had wanted to write about Catholics, she couldn't find any. She had to write about Protestants. These people, even let's say the protagonists in Greene, who snatch at fragments of church doctrine and liturgy as they grapple with their salvation and damnation, they're not coming out of this thick Christian or Catholic identity. They're not embedded in a world of liturgy or quote-unquote Talmud Torah. These are all people who are very well read in theology, but they were not part of that world. And if I'm speaking about Greene, I don't even know if I'd make an exception for those of his characters who are priests. I could discuss that at greater length, but not now. In Agnon, perhaps as a consequence you never, or hardly, if I say never, somebody's going to correct me, so let me, hardly ever. You don't get the sense of crisis where a lonely individual has to choose unambiguously between faithfulness and betrayal. You take the longest novel and the one where this issue is most directly addressed, Tmol Shel Shom, and several times Agnon editorializes about the mentality of Yitzchak Kummer and his group, and he makes it very clear that their defection from Orthodox practice was a matter of conformity to the behavior of the peer group, drifting. You come to the end of the novel where Yitzchak Kummer finds his way to the old Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and you think of this famous scene. Remember, at this point, he is interested in getting married in that community, and he's behaving the way they behave. But at one point, he's alone. Times come for Mincha, this beautiful description of sunset. And now the decision is he going to daven Mincha or not? I mean, he doesn't have to conform. Nobody's watching him. That moment of choice comes to him. At that moment, Yitzchak Kummer says to himself, it's a good thing for believers to pray, but what's the use, to'elet, ma mo'ilat tefillah, for someone like me? I mean, I'm not really part of what business do I have with it? Then he starts davening, and as he's davening, he asks himself, is this what I really want to do? But pasuk rodef pasuk, once you start davening, you already are an automatic pilot, as it were. So he is going through the motions. He finds himself praying, belev nishbar v'nidkeh. Somehow he's not simply saying words, something is happening here. He's brokenhearted. Why is he brokenhearted? Jacob Katz suggested, way back, that the reason he's brokenhearted is because he is returning to tradition, but he has no real intellectual basis for doing so. He has no intellectual conviction. However that might be, and however sincere that conversion might be, although in the grand trajectory of the narrative, things don't work out that well for Yitzchak Kummer. I don't want to ruin the ending for those who haven't read the book. But the conversion at that point is still taking the easy path. It's not a heroic decision. Like the dog Balak, who is a more entertaining, albeit also things don't end up too well for him, the most entertaining characters in all modern literature. Buchach is thinking what he wants, why is he going where he's going? Is chayim shel tam ani mevakesh. I'm looking for a meaningful life. Neither Buchach nor Yitzchak Kummer are looking for a life on the dangerous edge. By contrast, we take some Graham Greene, and the typical thing that happens that people make these desperate decisions of faithfulness, of betrayal, end of the affair, Sarah Miles takes a vow to commit herself to a God that she doesn't believe in. If you're not into Green, you should read it. You should figure it out on your own, but just giving you examples. In the heart of the matter, Scobie, a pious Catholic, takes communion in a state of mortal sin for reasons I'm not going to go into. Knowing what he's doing, even the hunted priest in the power and the glory was aware that he is living at the edge. Green was fond of a 19th century poem, The Hound of Heaven. And the narrative line there, God is the hound, and the sinner is running away down the alleys and presumably running to prostitutes, and the Hound of Heaven, God keeps running after him, come back, come back. Labyrinthine streets of corruption. Agnon was he knew how to walk the streets, wander around, and many of his characters are people, eidetic images of when Herschel and Sipur Pashut, walking around just endlessly in his frustration. And if we're talking about dogs already, Balak, wandering the alleyways of old Yerushalayim. But they're not pursued by God in quite the same sense. They're trying to understand what's happening to them, and they're not doing a very good job of doing that. They're rather than being prey, being pursued, they are strollers, and I wonder, can a dog be a flaneur? Balak is wandering around from street to street, from alley to alley. If I would use William James's phrase, the religion that you confront in Green is a tough-minded religion. It's a very realistic religion. In Agnon, if there is realism, it's a realism that is heavily mediated through irony. Move to the sense of sin. You think of sin in Agnon. We take stories in Sefer HaMaasim, Pat Shlema, I want to mention again later. What happens in Pat Shlema? The narrator has to mail a letter for Dr. Gutiel Naaman. You all know it symbolizes Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Torah. He doesn't decide, for some complicated Greenian reason, that he's not going to do it. He'll reject his mission. He'll turn his back on Dr. Naaman. There's no defiance. What happens, he's waylaid by this man named Gressler, and he ends up somehow in a restaurant where he's famished and he's unable to get a meal. You take Talit Acheret. The narrator starts out wanting to pray in Yom Kippur with his grandfather. It's a dislocation because his grandfather's obviously dead. And one thing happens after the other, and within a very short span of time, he has sort of frittered away the day. Whatever else goes wrong there, at the very end, the narrator is filled with a mood of agmat nefesh, So it translates consternation or or chagrin. It's not simply because what happened immediately, he's wearing a tallis where there's only 3 strings instead of 4 strings. He frittered away the precious hours of the holy day. B'lo tefillah u'b'lo klum. And when a writer like Agnon, with a rich vocabulary, uses a word like klum, which is a very flat word, he's doing it deliberately. He wasted the day. Again, this is not the sense of sin of a person who has made evil his good, who has done the wrong thing. It's a sense of failure more than a sense of transgression. Now, this difference is not confined to religion. And it's not just as Agnon wrote about religion, differently than he wrote about everything else, because in general, there's a commonplace of Agnon criticism that his heroes, certainly the male protagonists, underline, are passive. Does Agnon actually inhabit, as a matter of course, non-religious individuals who live their lives on a stark, irreversible act of choice? I mean, Green, it's not just the Catholics. The communists, people are living at that edge. In Agnon, you really don't get, certainly not among the male characters, you don't get that kind of picture. Childhood. In Agnon, no matter how shrewd and realistic he is about people in general, childhood experience is treated with a certain aura. I mean, if you think of religious authenticity as a return to a childhood wholeness, rather than a leap into a dangerous and even inconceivable future, it's not surprising that when he does reminisce about his childhood or the narrator's childhood, what he provides is a reservoir of religious warmth and authenticity. I mean, Kurzweil wrote an article about Agnon's depictions of Yom Kippur, and he particularly recommends not a work of fiction, but the preface to Yamim Noraim. The idea of the child with his father in shul, with the candles in the shul, and so forth. Again, the Christian writers I'm referring to, their world of childhood is fairly harsh, brutish, and very often blighted from the cradle. If in Hamashal Nimshal, Agnon sends his emissaries to literal hell, actually visits, but they're visiting on tourist visas. Many of Green's most striking characters did not have to take out naturalization papers to live in hell. They seem to have been born with a taste of sulfur in their mouths. It's not only that they lack the primeval sustaining experience of God we have in Agnon, they're in a different universe. In Agnon, God is in heaven. Skepticism, backsliding, failure come later with the hard knocks of life, whatever the reasons are. For Green, and for people like that, evil is in the saddle, and it's only great struggle and suffering that open the door to a world animated by divine love. Neither the substance of religious tradition nor happy memories of childhood provide the basis for mature religious flourishing. For Agnon, tradition is a substance of religious life, and childhood can serve as the incubator of faith. Evil. In writers like Green or Mauriac, the most powerful moments are very often a fiery and desperate rebellion, which is described from the inside. Whether you're speaking of a narrator, in the first person, or a third person narrator who is using kind of indirect narration. Agnon is not interested in this kind of anatomy of evil even among his most negative characters. Let's give you one contrast. Graham Greene has a short story called The Hint of an Explanation. It's about a infidel baker who tries to get the narrator, who at the time of the story is a child, to smuggle out a piece of the communion wafer in order that the baker should put it under the microscope and see, is it really whole? Is it really what it's supposed to be or not? Now, this baker is presented convincingly as an unhappy, lonely individual driven by hatred and envy. And the child is paradoxically mystified by the energy with which this Epicurus can hate something that doesn't exist. In fact, what drives a child to religion is that somebody who's an atheist should be so obsessed. But it's the baker who's sort of the active character. And the child is the observer, somewhat affected by him. You will find such defiant self-damnation elsewhere in Greene. You even find it in somebody like C.S. Lewis. Greene wants to display these characters as he would any other character, perhaps even more than any other character. Let's go back again in Agnon. You want a negative character in Agnon. Come back to Mr. Margressler in Pachlima. There's little doubt, and I've not seen any doubt among the commentators, that Mr. Gressler is an emblem of evil. The narrator of the story knows Mr. Gressler. They've had meetings before. From time to time, Mr. Gressler turns up in his life, and the narrator knows one thing. He knows that nothing good comes out of his contact with Mr. Gressler. It always ends with baleful results. And nevertheless, Mr. Gressler always sweeps him away. And was always exciting here. It's impossible to say no to him. At the same time, Agnon is not interested in asking why is Mr. Gressler the way he is. That's just the way he is. In the 1950s, one of my teachers, Rav Soloveitchik, produced a manuscript later published as The Emergence of Ethical Man. And there he wrote about two different ways of thinking about sin. One is the sense of Lucifer, this rebel angel who defies God. The other, which is modeled after, in his opinion, after Hound of Heaven and Gan Eden, is the person who is sort of hypnotized by sin, was not a deliberate rebel, but it was somehow dragged into it. I don't want to say that great writers at Agnon and other writers are simply playing out a typology of Jewish and Christian. But the Rebbe says, in Jewish writing, the Gan Eden model is the more dominant, and that Christians have developed the Hel ben Shachar model much better. Again, I'm not saying that Agnon acted the way he acted for this reason or that reason. How are we doing for time?
We need questions.
What?
Questions and answers.
Okay, so I think I'll finish this piece and leave out the last piece. Again, I don't want to reduce great artists to exemplars of a particular theology. It may seem to be the case that Agnon's experience of human nature, and himself and others, constrained what he wrote about. It's a fact that the people that Agnon knew, that he lived among, had a certain relationship to tradition. It seems that Agnon had a predilection for passive protagonists, again, limiting myself to the men for the moment, and others were more attracted to the melodrama of desperate risk. Nevertheless, there's something to think about at this point. The last section that we're going to skip is about Agnon as a custodian of the history of Jewish people. And I can stop here without giving you that entire discussion. I probably should. Story that I discussed in the last section is Hasiman. And again, if we're speaking of Agnon as a religious writer, part of what I discussed today, or what I did discuss today, is very relevant. It's a question of how you view human nature and the strengths and weaknesses of each model. But last and not least, even though I'm not spending time on it, is that aspect where a religious writer is a person who both expresses his own individual passion, as Ibn Gabirol does in Hasiman, and also, and this for the child Agnon is amazing to him, the same Ibn Gabirol, who wrote Shachar B'Keshcha, is the same Ibn Gabirol who wrote Shvi'a Niyah, who also spoke for the people. For a Jewish religious writer today, that example is important. I think Agnon was preoccupied in some of his writing with that relationship between the artist and the religious individual. And I believe that in Hasiman, he got at it in a way that, at least for me, is more accurate and more powerful than in his other writings. But I will not belabor further. Maybe we'll have other opportunities.
Thank you very much.